Have you ever stepped outside, taken a deep breath, and felt something shift inside your soul? Almost as if the weight you've been carrying is lighter, and maybe even gone? Well, that's the quiet power of meeting God in His creation. Welcome to Speaking from the Heart, where we explore spiritual wisdom rooted in gospel and bring it into our business, work, and personal lives. I'm Richard Fontenay, and I'm glad that you stopped by to listen today, because we're going to be talking about walking with God in the fullness of nature. How creation itself can be a sacred place where we meet Him, learn from Him, and find the renewal we desperately need to do our work and live with purpose. Now, Jesus frequently withdrew to quiet places, as I mentioned before in these podcasts. In Luke chapter 5, it says, "But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed." Now, these lonely places were often hillsides, gardens, and by the water. He understood something we sometimes forget. Nature helps us slow down enough to hear God's voice. Now we're going to cover 4 points today. Nature as God's classroom, as a place of renewal, as a mirror for business and work, and as a place of worship and gratitude. And as we draw to a close, we'll stop and reflect on today's message and make our own application to our business, work, and lives. Now let's move on. The first point, nature as God's classroom. When you step into nature, you're entering into God's living art gallery. Every leaf, river, and mountain whispers His creativity. But nature is more than beauty. It's a teacher. In Matthew chapter 6, Jesus says, "Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barn. And yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they?" And here Jesus uses creation to teach trust. Here's a story about Sheila. Sheila was in a retreat for nurses. She was caught up in her anxiety about controlling others to the point that she was constantly on her phone, keeping tabs on her team. On the second day, during a silent hike in the early morning, she spotted a deer munching on grass. She stopped walking and looked at that peaceful scene. Tears filled her eyes. Later, she told the retreat master that at that moment, she felt God saying, "You don't have to control everything. Let me carry you." And that one encounter shifted how she led her team. Point number 2, nature as a place of renewal. Our work, whether running a business, leading a team, or caring for a family, can drain us physically, mentally, and spiritually. Nature has a way of restoring what the world depletes. In Psalm 23, the psalmist reminds us, "He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul." Now, this isn't just poetry. It's a practical truth. When we spend time outdoors, even for a few minutes, stress levels drop, and creativity rises, and our perspective shifts. A friend of mine shared this story. She and her mother were out walking one day along a prairie path, and they came across trees that overhung above them. It was being in a cathedral of trees, she said. And at that moment, my friend realized that God was present in the silence of nature. And that was a pivotal moment for her, one she recalled throughout her life. Here's another story about a nonprofit leader who was on the verge of burnout. And she met her coach for a session in a public park instead of her office. And sitting under an elm tree, she told her coach that she felt like her soul could breathe again. And from that time onward, she started scheduling her meetings as walking sessions in nature. And her team noticed the difference both in their energy and in their ability to focus. Point number 3. Nature as a mirror for business and work. Now, creation reflects rhythms. Sunrise and sunset, seed time and harvest, winter and summer. In business and life, we often ignore these rhythms, pushing ourselves endlessly without seasons of rest. And in Mark chapter 4, Jesus says, all by itself, the soil produces grain. First the stalk, then the head, then the full kernel in the head. And here, Jesus is explaining that growth takes time. Now here's a story about a new product we launched. I became frustrated because that product was slow to gain traction. And then one day, I recalled how farmers plant seeds and trust the unseen work beneath the soil before seeing a harvest. A meditative take on Jesus' explanation. When I realized this, I was able to embrace the nature rhythm. And I was able to realize this in our business, continuing to focus on nurturing relationships instead of forcing results. And several months later, our slow and steady work resulted in a much broader acceptance of the product. That's another example of how growth takes time. And finally, point number 4. Nature as a place of worship and gratitude. Now, sometimes the best church service isn't inside 4 walls. It's standing on a hilltop at sunrise, praising the God who made it all. In Romans chapter 1, Paul teaches that God makes everything perfectly plain. Even the invisible is visible, if we open our minds to see the things he has made. Now here's a story about a business person who, after a long day of meetings, walked along the quiet lake shore. The sunset turned the water golden, and in that moment, he felt God's nearness so strongly, he simply said, "Thank you." And that feeling of gratitude changed his approach to his work. And that reminds me of a poem I once wrote, unpublished. The last stanza goes like this: God's love is seen in all his creation. His beauty is everywhere. Give thanks and praise. Stop, look, and listen. He is there. He is here. He is everywhere. Now. So how can we bring this message of nature as God's cathedral to life? God's creation isn't just a backdrop for our lives. It's an active meeting place, a teacher, a restorer, and a sanctuary. And if we slow down enough to notice, We can hear his voice in the rustle of leaves, the crash of waves, and the stillness of a quiet dawn. And as we wrap up today, let's ask ourselves, what insight, word, or phrase resonated with us today? What touched our hearts in a new way? And what can we do to turn this teaching into action, enriching our businesses, work, and lives? And how can we share this reflection with someone else this week? Let me know how you made out. Our next episode will be about know thyself, know your true self. And this is where we'll talk about letting go, accepting the present moment, touching the divine within, and finding freedom from the traps of our egos. Until then, take some time to walk with God in the fullness of nature. Your soul, that deepest part of your being, will thank you. I'm Richard Fontenay, signing off until we meet again next week, if not before. So long for now.